Conor does. He's worked across a whole different range of areas across the UK and Ireland, including particularly around cards and payments. And he's also represented Visa on the UK Finances Payments Board, as well as being a member of the UK Payment System Regulators Panel. Also on my left, we have Baroness Kramer, who I'm sure needs no introduction to Lib Dem members in the room. Baroness Kramer is former MP, former London mayoral candidate, former minister, and still currently a very active member of the Social Market Foundation Policy Advisory Board, which I'm very pleased about. So welcome to Baroness Kramer. On my right, we have Sheldon Mills from the Financial Conduct Authority, the FCA. Sheldon is the Executive Director of Consumers and Competition. He's been the lead on the consumer issues and recently gave a very interesting speech on frogs. If you haven't seen the speech on frogs, I would highly recommend it. He may allude to more about frogs in his opening remarks, but has been one of the key sponsors for the Consumer Duty, the new compensation and redress framework, and also technology and artificial intelligence use in financial services. So a broad brief, but I think particularly on this issue of financial inclusion falls within Sheldon's expertise and experience. And then on my right is Sarah Porretta, the Deputy CEO of Fair for All Finance. And Sarah's recently stepped up from her role as Executive Director of Policy and Strategy. And before that, she was she worked for the Money Advice Service, as well as a number of other organisations. She specialises in strategy, stakeholder engagement, and innovation. And no one, I think, is more expert on the issue of financial inclusion and challenges around vulnerability than Sarah. I'm looking forward to hearing her remarks on that. But perhaps we'll start on my left, and then we'll move along. Conor, I wonder if you would say a few words to why is this issue of financial inclusion an issue for Visa? How do Visa see this as a challenge?
Thank you. Thanks, Theo, and thank you to my fellow panelists for joining us on the panel. And thank you for everyone for avoiding the sun and lunch to be here for such an important topic. I guess from a Visa perspective, inclusion is super important, and we're proud to sponsor today's event, and proud to the work we're continuing to do with the foundation on Talk of the Towns and on our Vitality Index, which I'll come back to, I guess. I guess from a Visa perspective, if we look at financial inclusion from three perspectives, you can look at it from many perspectives. I just look at it from three in the opening remarks. The first one being financial inclusion for the UK. For the UK as a country and as an economy, and being included, the UK is a leader in financial services, and particularly in payments is a global leader. Globally, we have payments companies based here, and we have a lot of the innovation that we then see across the rest of the world being based out, being started here and based in the UK before it goes elsewhere. So it's important for the UK to continue to remain that and to be included in the global economy and to be included in innovation that comes and new technology that comes. I guess there's inclusion of local communities. So with the work with the foundation, so the benefits that can come to a local community of being included in digital and financial services and financial solutions. And we've done a lot of work with the foundation on Talk of the Town, which has built a vitality index. And for those who don't know, an index across the towns, across all the constituencies in the UK, as to how they can benefit from digital growth and from the growth of digital inclusion and financial inclusion. 86% of those towns could unlock more growth if they were more included in digital and in financial solutions. And I think we've just refreshed the data, so there's going to be new data and a new index for towns in every constituency that I'd encourage everyone to be accessing. And then I guess there's the inclusion for end users. Okay, so for consumers and businesses across the UK to be included in financial services, to be included in all financial services. And from a visa perspective, we then focus on financial services from a paying and being paid, right? And that can be payments is such a wide topic, from wages and benefits and pensions. It's paying each other, it's paying bills, it's buying goods and services, and it's even moving money to and from and moving money abroad. And it's how do we make sure everybody has access to those, and from our perspective, particularly making sure that those experiences are world-class experiences, and making sure that they're world-class experiences that everybody can have access to. So we go back to, when we're working on it from a visa perspective, we go back to focusing on the outcomes. What does great look like? And the outcomes from I guess it's the trust, easy, and choice perspective. And trust is, it must be secure, it must be reliable and easy, it must be fast, it must be convenient, and then also there must be choice. And there must be choice. We looked at not just from a consumer perspective, but also from a business perspective and a small business perspective. And do they have access to the payment methods that people want to use as well? And then we look at new technology and digitalization, and how digitalization plays that key role in helping unlock and helping have those amazing experiences. And digitalization is a key role, even if people want to pay with, if they want to pay with cash, if they want to pay by bank transfer, if they want to pay with card, or if they want to tap their phone. There's digitalization can help in all of those experiences and help to include everybody. And finally, just 3 examples we're working on from a visa perspective. We can go back to. One would be however anyone is paying, how do we make sure that we all work together to stop fraud before it happens? Fraud is a really important topic at the moment, and a growing topic from the UK perspective. We're seeing fraud grow. From a card perspective, we're at record low, historic lows of card fraud, but we're seeing fraud across the entire financial ecosystem growing. So from a visa perspective, we're taking the work we've been doing over the last 40 years in bringing our artificial intelligence to bank transfers and to other ways to pay, to make sure that we're helping all types of payments and making sure it's included. And then greater control, I think inclusion plays to control. People are choosing different ways to pay because they want to be in control of their payments. So I think we've seen a lot of work, and we've done a lot of work across the entire ecosystem with helping people control transactions, helping them budget, and helping people with subscriptions. Some of the new solutions that we brought to the UK, and world first we brought to the UK, and now we're working on how do we bring those controls and how do we bring the consumer protections to bank transfers. So we're launching a new account-to-account scheme here in the UK as a global first, and that'll be live towards the end of the year into 2025 that we're very excited about. And then the last thing we're working on, of course, is, why we're here at the panel, is the work we're doing with government, with regulators, with the industry, with stakeholders, with society, just to make sure we're all working together to make sure that we achieve that inclusion.
Great, thanks, Conor. Sarah, maybe I can turn to you. You can sort of map out for us what's the scale of vulnerability that we see, and how do you see, what are the drivers of the challenges around financial inclusion?
Sure. So financial inclusion is a reality for millions of people across the UK. One of the things we started saying a lot last year was this is not a niche issue. So our segmentation model thinks that there are around 20 million people that are vulnerable to exclusion. And it's very hard to get on in life if you are financially excluded. We had a conference earlier in the summer, and we had a lived experience panel. And the person that made the most impact, I think, on that whole day was a lady who talked about her experience as financial exclusion. And the word she kept using was, why aren't I good enough? Because it didn't matter how hard she tried, there were blocks and lack of access to products and services wherever she looked. But you can't really exist in society without access to those products and services. So we see financial inclusion as a barrier to growth, to health equalities. It exacerbates poverty. You look across multiple policy areas, actually financial exclusion is a challenge, and financial inclusion is an opportunity to help with some of those challenges as well. I think it's great that we've got a commitment now to create a national financial inclusion strategy, and I know the Lib Dems have been hugely supportive of that. Some faces in this room in particular have been powerhouses in that space, and this is a real opportunity. But in terms of the levels of financial exclusion, as I mentioned, 20.3 million people in financially vulnerable circumstances. And the causes for that can be very varied. So ill health, low or unstable incomes, lack of savings, lack of resilience to life events like losing a job or bereavement. So lots of different factors that drive people further away from inclusion. We also see the impacts of the poverty premium. Martin Kopak, sitting over there, has done a lot of work in this space, and that's really about the fact that being poor literally costs you more. So not only are you suffering from low income, but you're paying additional costs on that maybe people on higher incomes just don't pay. In terms of geography, we see, like many pictures of inequality, we see a kind of similar mapping. So a swathe of people across the northwest and into parts of Yorkshire, clusters in South Wales and the central belt of Scotland. Towns and cities tend to be worse. And on a regional basis, London and the northeast are the worst off. And our segmentation model has just been relaunched and the numbers have gone up. So we were quoting 17.5 million previously. And some of the movements we've seen are in the difficult debt segment. So renters really struggling to pay debts, and cost of living and increased rents is really driving people who were managing into that kind of not managing category. Younger renters and younger people are also being more acutely impacted. And in terms of kind of locally community finance, we do a lot of work with community finance providers, and we can talk about a little bit more about that. And that is a solution. But one of the things we've been saying for quite some time now, and something I see as a risk, and it's something I've seen play out. I worked at Lloyds Banking Group for a number of years before I moved to Money and Pension Service, and have worked in that financial inclusion space, is that yes, community finance is incredibly important and provides services that maybe mainstream banks don't provide, but 20 million people requires financial services, mainstream financial services, to participate at a significant level to really drive change in financial inclusion. So what I've seen in the past is this feeling that we'll do a little bit with community finance and that's enough, but actually this is about, I think, the solution is really around better products and services that really meet people's needs, mainstream financial services being really innovative and inventive about how they might better serve people. It's also about data. Some of the data that's used for decisions really drives exclusion because we're not getting an accurate picture of whether people, for example, can pay for credit. So there's lots of things like that which we think could change, but it does require that mass participation across the sector. And it's so important. Why would we want a society where people don't have access to basic products and services that help them be economically active in society?
Great, thanks, Sarah. Sheldon, what's the role of a regulator in this space? And obviously we have the consumer duty, and perhaps you can say how you see that so far, what's its impact on financial inclusion?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for arranging this panel, and thank you for so many people coming on a sunny day. I'm glad there is this much interest in this critical issue. I mean, the starting point is the financial services obviously play, as you've heard from Conor and Sarah, a key role in everybody's day-to-day life. And if you don't have access to financial services, be that a bank account, be that insurance, or even have access to the things which allow you to access financial services now, internet access and a smartphone, then you start at a disadvantage. And our studies also support what Sarah says in terms of how many people are either struggling to access financial services, or when they do have access to financial service, struggle with certain aspects of that, be that understanding or the services that they're provided with. Our financial lives survey showed that 23% of UK adults, that's around 12.1 million people, had issues accessing a financial service or product in the last 2 years. And that's in the context of 40 million people telling us that they were either not coping or were struggling to cope financially. So there is a lot of harm, or at least issues, underlying issues out there. And many of the groups that Sarah mentioned, low-income household, unemployed adults, people not in work due to long-term sickness or caring responsibilities, renters, single adults with financially dependent children, and those living in the most deprived areas of the UK, including South Wales, where I'm from, are a part of that. But many people across the country were affected by the pandemic, were affected by the rising cost of living, including middle-class households, however we want to describe them there. So I think a lot of people have struggled, or at least have to think about how they're coping. in the past couple of years. I think there's a few elements as to what we as a regulator can do. Formally, we have no objective to deal with financial inclusion. There is no statutory objective for us to look formally at financial inclusion. We do have an objective in terms of consumer protection. That is not the same as financial inclusion. They are different things, and it's really important that people understand that those are different things. That said, obviously, when you do think about consumer protection, you are also thinking about financial inclusion. You are having an impact on that. So the way in which consumers can access services does have, there is a diagram which includes financial inclusion in relation to that. And that's how I see the consumer duty. It can help with financial inclusion issues, but it is not a panacea for them. And what the consumer duty is, it asks the 45,000 or so firms that we regulate, from the largest firms in the country to the smallest, to ensure that they're trying to achieve good outcomes for customers. And that's across a range of areas. And one area which I think is helpful for financial inclusion is the consumer understanding and customer support area. So once you are looking for a financial service, firms are obliged to, for the terms and conditions or the marketing to be clear, so that people can understand that, and not just clear to what their mythical consumer might look like, clear to everybody who might wish to access that service. And we'll do more work in that area. And then once you have a financial service, and I appreciate that still means the people who don't access the services are not included in what I'm about to say, but once you have one, the support that you get as you go through the lifetime of that product should be equivalent to how much effort went into attracting you. And I think that's important. I do think, though, that there are, and it's not necessarily an FCA view, this might be a personal view, but I do think it is important, if financial services are the lifeblood of the economy, are the thing which will spur growth, spur innovation, as well as support those who are struggling. And those things all go together. They're not mutually exclusive at all. Then that there are certain obligations in the fabric for our largest firms and our smallest firms when they're serving the economy and communities as to how that is done. And I think there is a debate that needs to happen as to who does what in this space, what types of institutions are most appropriate to serve certain types of communities, can best meet their needs, and how that can best be delivered with the right sort of funding, the right regulatory environment. I think we have worked quite a lot in terms of innovation in this sector, in terms of trying to encourage people to meet excluded people. So we had what we call a tech sprint up in Scotland a few months ago, where we did a big competition for different types of solutions to meet financial inclusion issues. Some of those were issues like Sarah was talking about, how can you get better access to credit? So trying to understand people's ability to pay, pay the rent, why is that not taken into account, pay the mortgage, etc. So those sort of issues. And we don't just do that sort of thing. I mean, something which people don't notice that we've been doing for the past 2 years, I'm very proud of, is our credit information market study, which is trying to revolutionize the way in which credit information is provided. At the moment, there's a reasonable duopoly of a few firms which control that, and trying to get innovation in that space to allow other actors to come in so that we can serve a wider group of needs. And with the body which is taking forward that, the industry body which is taking forward that on a voluntary basis, one of the actual objectives that we put in place there is financial inclusion, actually. So they are actually explicitly ensuring that the new innovation in that space will have an eye to financial inclusion. I think one of the questions I was asked is competition innovation sort of anti-financial inclusion. No, I think it's absolutely essential that we have innovation in this space. So there are real risks with the way in which data can be used, the way in which data can be personalized, and the use of AI. But there are also opportunities if there are ethical principles and sensible principles on the use of that And I think that can help with the excluded. I think there is a data problem, there are data issues out there that can help with. There are risks which come with that as well. But I think we can't stand still. We've got to take risk in order to solve some of these problems. I think, once we've got to these numbers of tens of millions of people who are excluded, unfortunately, there is no one solution, but it's only through risk and innovation, I think, that we'll start tackling some of these problems, because as we know, there isn't enough money just to throw a check at it and solve it that way.
Great. Well, I think one of the themes that we're already starting to hear from you, Conor, on is that local communities rather than just end users are an important part of inclusion. Sarah, you talked about community finance providers, and it's something that you touched on as well, Sheldon. Baroness Kramer, I know this is an issue that you're interested in, and I think it starts with the US civil rights movement, if we want to start there.
Do you mind if I stand up? It's easier for me, so I'm used to doing this on my feet. Theo, thank you for setting that up. All of the comments that have been made are really powerful and really important. And I don't want to diminish the importance of things like access to cash, or to someone who can't have a credit card or can't get, the opportunity to buy a product that they need or whatever else. And I have to say, for the Liberal Democrats, in the third row back, you have our absolute expert on financial inclusion around individuals, Baroness Claire Tyler, who's been a really important player in this field. I wanted to focus on something very slightly different, which is to pick up, as Theo said, the community banking side of this. So I lived for nearly 20 years in the United States and watched the growth there of the community development financial institution movement. It began as part of a civil rights movement that in 1974, that became evident that the major banks were not lending into areas where ethnic minorities lived. So the regulators and the legislators stepped forward and said to those banks, if you want to be able to do things you like to do, like mergers and acquisitions and some big transactions, we're not going to give you permission until you can demonstrate that you're actually providing the full range of financial services into those communities. And if you can't do it yourself because it's not appropriate for the way you're staffed or your hierarchy or your costs, you're putting money into an entity that can. The community development financial institutions in the United States now have assets in excess of 222 billion. They are the backbone of finance in disadvantaged communities, but also many other communities. They are the backbone of finance for small businesses. They've been used by at least 2 administrations as a mechanism to get money into the parts of the economy that needed to be able to survive recession. And they are the driver of a lot of the economic energy we see in the United States. Most of the major banks now have their senior members that on the boards of these small institutions because it's so prestigious. And also those banks recognize that even though they had to put funds into this sector to get it going and to drive it forward, there's federal money being put in as well now, but even though they had to do that, they have seen a tremendous return by the rise of their new business customers who start coming through the system. Because with a CDFI, you go in and say, I have an idea for a business. They've got an entity that will come in and help put together the business plan. How do you market this? Do you need an angel investor? How do we put everything around you? You then pay, it's not a grant, not charity, so you then are able to develop as a coherent business. Now, here in the UK, I have for 20 years been to roundtables and workshops talking about how the heck do we get access to this kind of finance for our micro businesses, small businesses, and indeed, of course, they end up serving all the excluded community. How do we do that? And people said, well, we'll put pressure on the major banks. That hasn't worked. We'll have new challenger banks. Some of them dabble in this area, but not in a significant way. Alternate finance, that'll solve that, that'll fill the gap. It really hasn't happened. Open banking, which enables people to sort of spread the message around that they're looking for finance and haven't achieved it. That hasn't worked, and I've gone militant. We need a British version of the Community Reinvestment Act, We must recognise that there is a missing layer of banking across our communities. And if we want to see growth, as well as for all the social reasons of financial inclusion, I think we have to get serious about this kind of drive and make sure that we get that layer of banking here in the UK. That's me.
Sheldon, I wonder if you would mind coming back on that, because you said it, explicitly financial exclusion is not it's not in the consumer duty explicitly, or that one could interpret it in that way. But do you think that something of the type that Baroness Kramer is proposing is necessary, possible? Could it fit with the UK?
Yeah, well, we don't have an FCA view on this, but I have looked at the Community Reinvestment Act over many years and spoken to many different state-led regulators in the US on it, and visited some of the institutions Baroness Kramer is talking about. I think what we are seeing in the UK currently is pockets of exclusion are being dealt with sort of by either statutory provision through Parliament, such as the access to cash, or through us going to the edge of where our statutory objectives sit. And I think if it continues, if you continued with a trend of the numbers of people who are excluded, and we do need to do more data and work on that just to work out precisely the circumstances of what exclusion is. Because you can have people who are excluded, they can't get a bank account, full stop. You have people who are excluded, they can get credit, but it's costly. It's more costly for them to get credit than others. We can have people who can't get credit at all. And all of those people are in the 20 million. So you really do need to unpick that. But if we do have a continuous trend, and we do have potentially institutions which might not necessarily wish to serve due to risk or profit motivations or whatever motivation, and I have no view on that in the sense of moral view or whatever, that's a commercial decision, that's how we work. Then if there is a gap, and a societal gap, then there is a question. And we have to debate that question and work out what the solutions are. And the US has a proven solution. Don't get me wrong. If you go and dig into Google and you read about Community Reinvestment Act, then you find things which are true on Google, which is not easy these days. But if you do, there are challenges with it. So some of the firms which were invested in have had problems and issues, but by and large, when I speak to regulators in the US, it is seen as a success. And actually, the big investment firms, whilst it might have been seen as a cost at the beginning, as Baroness Kramer was inferring, it's now seen as a good, in part because those communities do have ideas, do have innovation, do have creativity, and they do need funding to support that. And you find vehicles then through those major investment banks into those communities, through these CTFIs and through those connections, and real prospects for return for those investments. So I think the Community Reinvestment Act is something that should be part of discourse and debate, and should be one of the things which might be something that we can consider as a solution to some of the challenges that we're discussing here.
So I think one of the interesting things that we're sort of touching on is who are the people that are excluded, and with these growing numbers, Sheldon talked about the middle class, and I think there is sometimes a misperception that the people who are excluded are the worst off, the lowest off in society, whereas actually, when you look at rising cost of living standards, I know Citizens Advice have done a lot of work on negative budget, and there's 5 million people that can't afford from their income to cover their housing, fuel bills, but there's another group above that are only just above that, and so constantly struggling. So could you describe a bit like who is it that we're talking about?
So it's, as Sheldon said, there are lots of different people subject to different vulnerabilities. I guess my reflection on the Community Reinvestment Act and closing that gap is, Fair for All Finance was established 5 years ago to really try and move the dials on financial inclusion, and it's got a reasonable budget. It's invested in community finance, and it's also then worked with all the mainstream banks to look at propositions where they might step into this market, and that has been incredibly hard. And I would say in most cases, the path of least resistance has been followed. So in terms of the millions of people that are being now reached that weren't before, it's not enough to bridge that gap, that 20 million gap. So I think if you were to say of that segment, is there a 5 to 10% that aren't being served through mainstream banking at the moment, and banks could start to think more creatively about how to serve those, that would really make a significant stride. And that's where something like the Community Reinvestment Act could support, or things like small dollar loans. So another thing from the US is small dollar loans. So, if you're somebody that wants to borrow £500 or £1,000, you can't borrow that from a mainstream bank at the moment. And in the US, you could, and we look at different affordability criteria for those smaller loans. So think about COVID. Overnight, we were able to roll out interest-free overdrafts to people and lend to people. That same innovation and that same ability to mobilise is what we need here. We need mainstream financial services to go, okay, what can we do quickly? And it also needs to be part of their licence to operate, because if you go around and talk to people in mainstream financial services, they don't think this is a terrible idea, and they're not awful people that don't want to do this, but they have to prove shareholder value. Why should I serve these customers? And they have to be able to prove that it's worthwhile to do. So I think that's where something like the Community Reinvestment Act comes in, where it's actually, this is now part of your license to operate as a bank, and there are segments that mainstream financial services could serve, and there are segments that they absolutely cannot. And that's where lots of different community finance organisations can come in as well and be more creative. And Salad, I think, is a really good example of how they've used data differently. So they're one of our investees. So they've looked at open banking data to assess affordability rather than credit referencing data. So it's back to your point about risk earlier. That is obviously different, maybe perceived by some as risky, but they've really crunched the data to show that it actually works, and it works better for customers and tells a better story about whether they can pay. So we need that data to match reality, and we need, the kind of innovation and oomph to get things done that we saw in times like COVID would be really helpful too.
Great. I'll come to questions in a minute, so be ready. But Conor, maybe obviously these are not a bank in the classic way that we're talking about with community development finance institutions. But I was interested if it's something that you have a view on, and then more broadly on we talked a bit about sort of the need for accurate data, and also the sort of role that innovation can have. How do you see those issues of sort of data innovation being able to help tackle this issue of financial inclusion?
And I think this is where that data side and just narrowly on open banking, I think we're seeing the UK lead the world again on that side. I think we're seeing that opening of the data and that access to the data to help. When we look at the use cases of open banking, it's not actually in payments at the moment. It's more in the data use cases and making it easy for trusted parties with consent from individuals, with consent from businesses to be able to, I guess, to the examples there, move from that kind of proof of income to proof of ability to pay, to be able to make those better decisions, being able to lend to more people, lend to the right people at the right time with the right amount, right? It's rather than just the old way of just getting 6 salary slips and 6 utility bills. You can use the data in a controlled and consent way to find that best way to lend. I think that's where we're seeing a lot of great use cases at the moment from that open data.
Great.
Just one point on inclusion. I was in Brazil earlier this year, or just a few weeks ago, for a conference on the finance of tomorrow, and I spoke with, I think, about 8 or 9 Latin American regulators and lots of businesses out there. And the reason why I was there was because of open banking. You reminded me, because we're seen as an expert. What I saw out there actually was a use of open banking which was all about financial inclusion. So in Brazil, 50% of the population doesn't have clean water or sanitation. But half of that 50% does have access to finance. No, truly, because the regulator has introduced several initiatives through payments mechanisms which have gone bypassed all of those pipes and that clean water, sadly, but it's gone straight to those people and allowed them to get access to finance. Now, there are issues with the way in which that finance access is provided, with some of the interest rates. We wouldn't necessarily countenance here. We had good discussions about that. But the mechanism and the ability to actually say to the financial services industry, there's a huge population here who are not included. And we need to include them both from a business perspective, an individual perspective, from a tax perspective, etc. This happened in Brazil, India, and many places over the world through open banking. And I sometimes wonder whether the fact that we've had it so good in terms of our payment system, in terms of our institutions and our access, means that we aren't necessarily utilising the innovations that we've developed in the way that they can be utilised to meet these sort of financial inclusion issues. So whilst I went there to provide my knowledge, I came back with a lot more than I probably provided, certainly in this phase.
Great. Questions? Yeah, so if you just, I'll take three at a time, as we have a few people with their hands up. If you just say who you are, and there is a roving mic, I think. Yeah, so we'll start at the front and then we'll work our way back. So 1, 2, 3.
Thank you for your speech today. One of the things that we haven't mentioned is financial education. I work in the bank. I see the worst side of this. Historically, most people have learned how to manage their finances from their parents. That's not a good source of quality financial education. We now are seeing banks go into schools. I've delivered that content. It focuses on preventing scams and frauds because that's where the cost is. They're not talking about benefits of compounding interest. They're not talking about savings or budget planning because they make a lot of money from people who don't have the financial knowledge to prevent them getting into persistent financial debt. So what can we do more? Because really, the only person I see doing anything on this issue is Martin Lewis.
Great.
Hi, my name is Hannah. I'm from Good Things Foundation. We're the UK's leading digital inclusion charity. And I'm curious, what are the panel respectively doing to address digital exclusion within your financial inclusion activities?
And I'm Sophie LeGrand-Green. I am a policy executive at Tizer. I used to also work for the FCA and the New York Fed. So I have seen myself just how effective the US system is. And my question was also going to be on financial education and kind of how that is a bit of a postcode lottery at the moment and how that can be improved. I'd also just throw in on the kind of US piece, obviously that came from redlining. And to my knowledge, we are not collecting that data here in the UK. And there's piecemeal bits of reports. So for example, the report recently by Rooted Finance, which suggests it could be happening in the UK. And so that seems to be quite a concerning call that we should be collecting this data. And that could sort of leverage some momentum on your aims, Baroness Kramer.
Great. So 3 questions. One on financial education. Do we just have to rely on a postcode lottery or Martin Lewis? One on specifically digital exclusion as part of the financial inclusion challenge. And then one more specifically on the data we're collecting. So I don't know if anyone wants to take a shot at one of those.
That's, may I pick up 2? That's financial education. Interestingly, my eldest granddaughter's just finished doing a business A-level. And her dad, who is in finance, is incredibly impressed by the finance piece of that A-level exam. Now, that means somebody in the education area has put together a curriculum that presumably could be pushed down and made available, certainly in secondary school, maybe a bit challenging for primary, but certainly in secondary school. So the material should be there and it should be possible. And as far as I'm concerned, this is as important as numeracy and literacy. But so absolutely critical. Digital exclusion, I'm not very good on. Can I just say on the redlining and exactly the term that's used in the United States? back in, I'm thinking now it was 2012, when Lord Sassoon was the minister, we managed to get a change to the Financial Services Bill that required regular reporting on a quarterly basis by postcode down to 5 digits that of the lending lending by postcode by the various banks. I'm not sure anybody's ever done anything much with that information. It may not be granular enough, it may not be detailed enough, but our hope had been to spark such a reaction as exactly the one that you described. And I do think we need desperately some research and academic work precisely in that area, because frankly, I'm a bit of a cynic, but I think redlining is happening in a very significant way.
Happy to pick up on the financial education one. So my previous role at Money and Pension Service, I wrote the National Strategy for Financial Wellbeing, which had a pillar on financial education. So unsurprisingly, do you think it's quite important? But I think the reason we haven't talked about it a lot today, we've got a financial inclusion flower, which is in our financial inclusion action plan for all. And we see poor financial capability as a driver of exclusion. But I always feel that we've got to be really careful as well, that we don't say that financial education could replace the systemic change we're talking about in terms of products and services, because there's a sort of lazy assumption, I guess, sometimes that people are excluded because they have poor financial capability. And of course, that isn't the case. Somebody could be highly capable and they just don't have a product that they can access. And that's where that lady comes in of like, what more do I need to do? Why won't you let me in? So I don't think by not talking about it, any of us probably on this panel don't think it's important, but it's not as well, it's not instead of, it's definitely as well as. And I also think financial education should also be seen as a consumer protection element as well, because it's really about enabling people to navigate the system. So at the moment, I think the last study we did when I was at MAPS was around £2 million is invested in financial education by financial services. And they really are the main investors into financial education in schools across the UK. So it hasn't been picked up as a curriculum issue, or it has in devolved governments, but not in England. And even where it has been picked up, schools can opt out. So there's a big kind of national issue really around coordination and making sure that young people have financial education from 4 years old all the way through and into adulthood, of course, when people are making decisions as well. So I do think it's really important, but my risk, and it's always a risk, is that people will do a bit on, banks might do a bit on financial education and say, job done on financial inclusion.
Conor, and then Sheldon.
I guess just if I cover two of those, I guess on education, I still wouldn't make it a cost play about scams and fraud. I think we're seeing, and Sheldon will have seen it in Brazil, and we see it in India, we see everywhere else where there's new technology and where you speed up payments. I mean, Brazil and India are now seeing a lot of fraud. They're seeing fraud follow very quickly, and scams follow extremely quickly. And that's why Visa spends a lot of our time, why we're spending over $10 billion on fraud technology to help Brazil, India, UK, everywhere on it. I think we spend a lot of our time talking about scams and fraud and educating about scams and fraud, particularly through TikTok and through other ways where, you know, it's education on those things are very important, and reaching the right people. We're seeing scams, Gen Z be impacted mostly by scams. So it might be a cost thing, but I think it's a fraud and friction thing for end users. And then on exclusion, on digital exclusion, I guess two things we're doing a lot, but I may focus on two. With the foundation, we're doing a lot, and you know, once we get past the vitality index and looking at different towns and looking at the digital readiness of different towns, I guess the roadmap that we've built out around digital champions and local authorities is an extremely important point to bring. We spend a lot of time talking about consumers and individuals, but we also do inclusion of businesses. And we saw that, I guess, through digital inclusion of businesses. We saw that through the pandemic. We spend a lot of time as an industry and with regulators unlocking and helping businesses go digital to be digital and to accept to sell digitally and be paid digitally.
Sheldon, did you want to come in?
Just two additional points. I mean, there's 2 points with education for me. There's the textbook education that you have at school, And I do think it's important. I think it is in the curricula, isn't it? Some form of financial education, whether it's been, yeah. I mean, my brother's an English teacher. I asked him about this. He said the maths teacher has to do it, and the maths teacher's finances aren't that great. There we go. But I think it's there. But like all things which are put in a very busy curriculum for schools, how do you do it? It's sort of not easy. But I think that's important. How do we prepare our young children and young adults for a healthy financial life? Something which a society should be very focused on. But the second point, which hasn't been raised yet, is just that in the moment education. So the reality is you can be an expert in managing your finances, but you will still be caught out by a scam. You can be an expert in managing your finances, but you might not spend an hour a month bothering with them, and then you miss opportunities. And we see that all the time. So what we ask firms to do is think about how they design their products and services, how they communicate them, and get that behavioral understanding that sadly, and I include myself in this, we don't think about our finances every day. It's not the most interesting thing to think about, and we don't pay attention to that. So basically, the institutions need to grab that attention when they've got it and educate in the moment very quickly so that people can make effective choices. And I think that's why you see the focus on fraud and scams, because it is one area where actually, if you're making a payment and somebody is worried about it, they can phone you immediately or stop the payment and talk you through it to make sure you make the right choice. And I think we encourage the institutions to do this, even though it annoys me when I get stopped from making a payment, because that's, and I think we need to do that in other bits and pieces as well.
Another 3 questions. So I'll take the lady here, the gentleman in the black shirt, and then I'll take one from the back, as I did say I would go towards the back, and then we'll come to you next.
Hi, thank you. My name is Carmen. I work for Impact on Urban Health, and I think about this issue very much from the lens of leading a healthy life. I'm wondering about, particularly Sheldon and Conor, we've done a piece of research on the energy sector, and of course we've talked a lot about the financial sector here, but other creditor sectors are causing a lot of problem debt, and that is really impacting people's ability to live a stress-free, healthy life. The consumer duty is obviously very important in trying to protect customers through the design of services and so on. But what we're seeing is that energy companies are causing a huge amount more debt than they used to, and are not I feel there's not the cultural, the same cultural response in that sector compared to the financial services. And I'd be curious to hear about any kind of lessons learned or how we can get other creditor sectors to take on this challenge.
Hello, Martin Kopak from Fair by Design. We exist to eliminate the poverty premium. That's the extra cost poorer people pay for essential services. So I think we can all agree these are really tricky, wicked problems. They're systemic problems that have been here for years. And when people talk about cost of living crisis, to me, it's the same issues, it's just more people are experiencing them. But I'm actually really optimistic at the moment. And that's because the government have said, announced there's going to be a new financial inclusion strategy, a new financial inclusion committee. And at last, I think regulators, government departments, businesses and civil society are kind of going to be forced to work together. And for me, that is a thing we all need to do. So my question for the panelists is, what are your ambitions for this new financial inclusion strategy? Thank you.
And then we'll at the back.
Hi, thank you for taking a question from the back. I'm a councillor, Chris Farley, and I'm a councillor in Richmond upon Thames, which Baroness Kramer will know very well. Even though it's thought of as a relatively prosperous area, we obviously have our pockets of deprivation, and I represent the town centre, which has a very significant housing community which fall into that category. I was interested to hear everything that's been said. And I just have a question about, does the panel see a place for a universal basic income?
Okay, so 3 questions there. I think one on energy sector as creditor, what could the energy sector learn? One on the note of optimism on the new financial inclusion strategy, what would your ambition be for that? And then universal basic income. So I don't know if you want to take one of those each?
Take the strategy one.
I can happily take the first one. So we've worked very closely with the UK Regulators Network, which is, as it says, most of the regulators coming together, and particularly with Ofcom, Ofgem, Ofwat, because it is correct. And we tried to bring the local government associations, well, we did bring the local government associations into that, but that's a bit more challenging. A lot of people are tripped into debt or into debt problems through things like council tax, now energy, given the cost of energy rising. And what we agreed upon was a set of principles that those regulators would take away. I see you frown, but this is a starting point for regulators. I mean, to get those people around the table and actually to agree something was very challenging because we don't have the same powers. I think people don't quite understand how these systems work. We have very different objectives, very different powers, very different resources. So to actually get the willingness of those people, I know it sounds odd, but it goes to your question as well, Martin. My ambition would be that those people come around the table easily, have the same powers, just solve the problem. And that was what we were trying to do there. And those principles are working. So you are seeing those regulators trying within their powers to work with the industry in order to try to think through how people are treated when they end up in debt. We regulate some of the firms, so some of the firms where somebody gets into serious debt and then somebody goes out to collect the debt, we do regulate debt collection agencies. So when those energy firms are using those debt collection agencies, or they have in-house debt collection agencies, those are regulated by us, and our Consumer Duty imposes new standards on those, which we've had discussions with some of our largest energy firms about. So it's a very serious issue. The other side of the issue is who pays for the debt advice. And at the moment, the significant part of that is that the financial services industry pays for most of that debt advice. And I do think there's a serious conversation about how that can be more fairly distributed. I'm not an advocate for the industry in that sense. It's just, polluter pays in a sense. I mean, we really should have that debate so that we can get, and this goes to your question, Martin, my biggest ambition actually, sounds pretty basic, financial inclusion strategy, is that people who are excluded can get good debt advice and good advice about their financial health. And I think that needs to come through both our institutions that we've just been discussing, so the banks, CDFIs, but also citizens' advice and those other parts of the community fabric, which is significant and important within local communities, so that actually people who might not have the education that we want everybody to have, but they can get that support and that's well funded. I think that would be a really good starting point so that people aren't opened up immediately to some of the more sharp practices that you sometimes see towards these people.
I mean, did you say?
I wanted to come in on the big vision,
a quick
strategy, a
quick
soundbite.
A soundbite of a big vision.
Okay, so the vision would be everyone in the UK has access to a suite of products that meets their needs. And what I'd also like to see is one or two seismic policies that really bring in millions more people to achieve that. So something auto-enrollment sized, something really big that would really shift the dials. Can I just sneak in as well a bit about digital inclusion? Because I felt like you got very sorely neglected when you asked that question. It was a really quick one to say that the thing that I struggled with when I started looking, we were working with Labour a little bit on what could be these big policies with digital inclusion, is it doesn't sit just within financial services. So people are excluded. So the BBC, it costs them a load of money. It costs the NHS a load of money. It costs every government department a lot of money. But there isn't that cohesive cross-policy, cross-area group on digital inclusion, which is why I think no one has a great answer within financial services.
We're nearly out of time, and I know Baroness Tyler wanted to say something, and I think it would be an injustice if we didn't give her a platform on this issue.
I should probably pick up the Richmond UBI question at some point in time.
On UBI, I feel like UBI is a great question, but it feels like it's a different panel. Okay. But my short answer on UBI is to make a difference on UBI, you need to give so much money that it becomes unaffordable. That would be my short criticism. But it's a different panel, and we're going to let Baroness Tyler.
Thanks very much. I would just add on digital inclusion, I think banking hubs have got a really important role to play. But I really wanted to pick up, I was so pleased when Sarah talked about financial inclusion no longer being seen as a niche issue. I think the fact that we're hearing about 20 million vulnerable customers and about a similar size of segment of the population who can't get access to sort of mainstream financial and banking services is absolutely huge. So my question, and Sarah raised it, is what more do we need to do to ensure that mainstream financial services are serving this segment? And I'm thinking, we've got a basic bank account. I don't think it makes much difference for myself. We've got it. But I think we need things like sort of a very, very basic products on small loans, credit, insurance and things like that. How can we get the sector to be thinking more about this? Is it something that the committee that Martin was talking about should be doing? And Sheldon, what do you feel the role of the regulator is here?
So Sarah, and then Sheldon, if you want to give, and then give some closing remarks, and then I'll hand to Baroness Kramer and Conor for your closing remarks as well.
So I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, Martin and I have brainstormed this at length, but our ambition is that suite of products. Basic bank accounts, done, it exists. I do think what we found when we looked at insurance is we're kind of at pre-policy stage with insurance. It needs a big kind of systemic look at risk, but that's possible. Something like small dollar loans could be that basic credit product if all mainstream banks were offering a smaller loan that was assessed in a slightly different way. So I agree. I think it is possible, but it needs that creativity and it does need a bit of a stick. So I will hand to Sheldon to talk about that.
Look, I mean, I think the role of the regulator is, I mean, our principal role is to make market work well for consumers. So that should be all in consumers, including those who are financially excluded. There are some aspects where we do not have powers, though. I don't have a power, I mean, I could try, have a go, to make banks provide small dollar loans. I mean, I could have a go, actually, maybe I should. But you heard it on YouTube, there we go. But we don't have a power to do that. And you wouldn't expect us to do so, given that we work in an economy where commercial solutions follow demand or innovation or funding, yeah? So our role there is to highlight the data, highlight what we're seeing, to convene, and to provide spaces within our sandbox to innovate, and to have our private voice for Treasury and our public voice where we think that's necessary. I think what we try to do is where we see specific harms which are occurring. So, for example, we worked through, Nigel Farage gave us a boon, actually. I mean, when we did that work to look at who was excluded, we found that actually, well, wait a minute, we've missed a data point here. There is 1 million people who don't have a bank account. That's a problem, given that there is a basic bank account piece of legislation. So we're straight on the phones to the banks to say, wait a minute, are you advertising this? Are you properly promoting this, etc.? And we expect to see change. So we can do that sort of thing, obviously. I think one of the areas where I think there needs to be a public or a private debate about is what Baroness Kramer has been talking about, which is it's not just about making mainstream institutions provide small dollar loans. It's what are the needs of these communities and how best can they be served and by what form of institution and at what level, locally, nationally, regionally, etc. And how will funding and commerce provide that as opposed to the state? Because the government cannot afford to provide all of that money to all of these individuals, I'm afraid, or all of those services. They have to be provided commercially. I think that is an important discussion if mainstream financial services are not necessarily going to find the risk appetite to continue or to provide services to certain communities.
Well, I'm coming out of this meeting feeling really optimistic and excited. I mean, we've got a whole series of people coming at this issue. And I see the opportunity. Sheldon, I think I'm going to go down on my knees and beg you to convene the opportunity for us to explore this issue more. I want to pick up on something that Sarah said, which is you have to use the banking license. And I think that's it, just asking the banks to break away from their business model is going to be very difficult. And I share with you, Claire, that frustration. We have banking hubs. Wouldn't you think there's a chance to put a whole lot of innovation through to deal with the customers coming through the door? And at this moment in time, that apparently is not the thought that is going through the high street banking mind. So pressure from the outside. And I think we have something around this CDFI strategy, Community Reinvestment Act, whatever else it is. I hope very much, because its objective is growth, that we have a government that might listen to that. And indeed, the FCA now has an excuse. I oppose it having a secondary objective to support growth in the UK economy, but I might as well use the damn thing. So it seemed to me that could play into that agenda as well.
Conor?
Just to echo, I'm optimistic as well. I'm very optimistic for the new strategy, and I'm excited. I mean, we're seeing a lot of innovation and digitalization help with inclusion, right? And I think digital inclusion and financial inclusion, we're seeing a lot of it in the banks. We're seeing a lot of work going on to help include. So I'm super excited, and just wanted to close by thanking Theo for chairing and for the panel.
Thank you, and thanks to Visa for sponsoring this event. I feel like I've been to a lot of panel events, and I feel like we've got something very clear coming out of this one. So it's very exciting, and thanks for being here. There is lunch at the back. Sorry, not if you're watching on YouTube. But thank you all for coming, and say thank you to the panel.